and you got directional control with the ailerons acting as rudders when the wing was up, and you had pitch control with a tail propeller, which was a very noisy thing. In fact, as my friend Jim Easton, I think, was out duck hunting at Edwards one day at the duck pond, and he said we were flying that Saturday, and he said he never heard such a racket in his life, and the ducks didn't know which way to go. They all took off, and they thought the end of the world had come. But this was an airplane that could perform. Well, there it is, going on the carrier. I think that's the Bennington. We actually had it on board 3 carriers, the Bennington, the Yorktown, and Saratoga. And we also took it on board an amphibious transport dock, the Ogden, which was a 2-pad helicopter deck for landing, but it was on the aft end of the airplane, so when we did a STOL landing, which was a 35-30 wing flap combination, fuselage level trim speed was 32 knots, and we could land even with a 12 or 14,000 pound payload in the STOL configuration over a 50-foot obstacle in 200 feet. And it was a very impressive airplane and easy to fly if everything was going right. If it wasn't, it was a real bear. But not only did we take it on board various ships, what we did, the airplane didn't have a mission, and Don Segner talked about an operational evaluation of different VSTOL concepts. And so we went out, we actually had Army, Navy, Air Force, Marines, and Germans assigned to the test force, and never figured out why we had the Germans, but it was kind of like, the definition of a camel is a horse constructed by committee action, and trying to keep everybody going the same direction was quite a problem in this thing. But we went out and talked to all the services to find out how would you use this concept if you had it. And we got them to add things that they wanted in a test plan, and we went out in what I call our graduation exercise, did the operational evaluation in the Rosamond Hills out at Edwards, and we actually simulated austere conditions of loading over at Rosamond Dry Lake, and then we'd come over the hill and come in and land in this very austere area. It was like soft sand. There was a California bearing ratio of less than 10, and it had a roll to the runway and a slope as well. And then we'd offload and take off and go pick up another payload. One amusing thing that happened at this particular function was we carried 2 rolling fuel cells, which I believe held 500 gallons each. And we didn't have gas in them, but we did have water in them. And due to the slope of the runway, when we landed to unload it, one of those cells got away from the loadmaster, and it took off down the desert, and that was the last we saw of it. And I think some hunters found it about 2 or 3 years later. What on earth is this? It was punctured, and it was laying there, flat rubber. And we actually carried a lot of different things, like 105 millimeter howitzer with the prime mover, which was a vehicle, but the airplane was too short. It was only 58 feet long. It was about, with the wingtips going past the propellers going past the wingtips, LTV built the airplane. They call it a fully immersible wing. And it was a lot easier to hover than a helicopter was because you didn't have a translational lift shift coming up to hover. You had one, but you didn't know it because of the disc loading, which was about 49, I think. And it was, I started to tell you about this 105 millimeter howitzer. The gun barrel was up in the cockpit with us, and we had it used as an armrest, and the trail had to be under the vehicle to get it on there, and but it worked, and it would actually, we had it up to 340 knots indicated airspeed, and of course it didn't have a bird-proof windshield. We were scared to death because the windshield was going just like this, you know, thought it was going to come in on us. And we, it was just a fantastic airplane. In fact, it was my wife's favorite airplane of all the ones I've been associated with. But we took it over to, I think we did a flight test program of about 3 years. First flight on it was in September of '64, and we flew, LTV did the first work on it, and they turned it over to us. And we took it out to Edwards, and we flew it for almost 3 years until it got it to the Paris Air Show and back in '67, and they turned it over to NASA at Langley, and they did their evaluation, whatever they wanted to do with it. And the last of 5 airplanes is located now at the Air Force Museum. It's painted red, white, and blue, which is the way they wanted to do it, to take it to the Paris Air Show. But I was hoping Dick was going to run out of time before he got to me, but I just gave you a gist of what went on with it, and I think that's enough.
A mere introduction, actually, and I would suggest you all get in touch with Jesse for not only this but many others later. We've seen the range of work that had taken place in the VSTOL arena, and now we bring it up to the present day. We bring it up with a uniquely qualified individual, Jack Jackson, Chief Pilot for Production Test at Boeing, intimately involved in all aspects of the AV-8, the AV-8B, the AV-8 Night Attack, AV-8B Harrier II. I really resonated to something, Jack, that you put in your write-up when you sent it into us. You said, looking at the highlights that you've had as a test pilot, you highlighted one that you thought was most important, what you saw as the most important function. That was getting a quality aircraft for the Warriors. And that's exactly where it is. We have here a Warrior himself, Marine pilot, TPS graduate. We can think of no one better suited to end this panel and bring us up to the present day. Jack.
Well, thank you. First of all, I'm going to answer 2 questions that have been asked me. First of all, I did not fly in the movie True Lies, the Harrier, at all. Secondly, and probably more importantly, I am not running for governor of the state of California. I got enough trouble in Missouri.
Yeah. You speak English too well, and you're too tall.
I have felt like I have been in on the second phase of VSTOL. These gentlemen here have laid the groundwork. Some of you in the audience have laid the groundwork for me to be able to fly the Harrier. One of the things that was the reason I got into the Harrier, I'm a VSTOL zealot. I think that's the way we're going to go. I think it's really neat. And, but one of the clinching factors for me is you heard about downward ejection seats. And if you're flying a helicopter, it's auto rotation. Like all good test pilots, I ran the numbers, and if you eject out of a helicopter, I found out that's like a banana going through a fan. So I decided I was going to be a Harrier pilot. The Harrier has been good to me. You've heard the stories. I'll share a couple that I have. In the briefings, I have heard variable stability. When I started out flying the AV-8A, my very first flight was a hover. And my friends, I put a whole new meaning to the word variable stability in that hover. My instructor was in a pickup truck. He was down below, and I saw the backup lights come on. And as he backed up rapidly from the hover pad, he said, "Lieutenant, who gave you base liberty? Get over the spot." It was rather unique. And it has been a pleasure ever since. One of the things that I wanted to share today, very briefly, was the aspect of VSTOL as I understand it from an airplane that has a conventional mode, has a hover mode, and then there's that phase that I think is very important, the transition from the hover or from conventional flight to and back and forth. When I started out, the mental gymnastics that was required, because you must go from wing-borne flight to your engine. And ladies and gentlemen, you will fly on that engine. Or in the Harrier, we have anhedral. Someone asked me why we have anhedral in the airplanes, and you know, that's so the outriggers will touch. You know, if I have dihedral, the outriggers aren't going to touch. Think about it. And so we have all these things. And that transition period was very important to me. And so you were always developing that transition mode from conventional flight to the hover and back again, and the engine. Now, it has been my experience in testing airplanes that if I am looking at flying qualities, and I'm sure you gentlemen can attest to this, you will have an engine surge. If you are looking at the engine, you will have a departure aerodynamically. And so you must be aware of all these things, and you're always looking, or I was, in the testing of this airplane, as to what was outside of what you were looking to do. And I would simply, in the essence of time, share one story with you. I can't compete with the gentlemen who've been on this stage before, but I will share one story that brings this analogy home. I was asked to go out in a simple flight and do a performance hover, the transition, and also look at the rudder rigging. How is this rudder rigged, and find out what the performance of this engine was in the hover. As I came back into the hover, and as I got about, I would say a ground speed of 45 knots, and about 50 feet was where we would trundle into the pad, the airplane snapped violently to the right. The right wing dropped, and I just pushed in a handful of nozzles and kicked up the dust and the dirt and went around, and I remembered my test pilot training. Communications 101. Never talk on the radio when your voice level is very, very high. That's not cool. And so the tower said to me, "Are you okay?" And I went, yes. And I managed to get it around the quarter. And of course, these things, and you gentlemen can attest to that, these things never occur when you have a lot of gas. You're always min-fuel when there's an emergency or something has gone wrong, and sure enough, I was there. Managed to get it around and landed on a landing rollout. In addition to having lost yaw control in the hover, that puffer had failed. I had lost nose wheel steering as well. And I was trundling down the runway, and some inconsiderate jerk put the 3-board over there, and the wingtip hit it. And as it trundled off the runway. Simple point, very simple point. And I share this with you because as I'm in the twilight of my testing career, I would share with these young test pilots this. It's always the thing that you're not looking for. And I was looking at the engine because I was about to fly on my engine when the flight controls gave out. A bolt had sheared in the pedals that fastened everything together. And I had no yaw puffer, I had no nose wheel steering, and so it was just, we managed to get the airplane on the ground. I will wrap my portion of this up in the interest of time, Doctor, by simply saying, someone asked me the other day, as you go over a career that I started flying Harriers in the early 70s, and I've never been out of the cockpit. That simply means I'm old. But having said that, what was the outstanding thing in your career? And my thing was, first of all, I went to a war in Vietnam. And I would like to thank all those test pilots who sent me a quality weapon system that I could fly. I thank you for that. You risked your time in the F4 and the A4 and the OV-10 and all those things that I had the opportunity to fly. In return for that, to wrap up my comments, I was pleased beyond measure at how the airplanes that we built and that you helped me test, both at the Boeing Company in St. Louis, that went off and did the mission, got the bombs on the target, whatever that mission was, and brought our young men and women home, and we won those wars, and I am very proud to be part of that. Thank you.
Jack, those were very fitting words to end this session. Ladies and gentlemen, a remarkable group of test pilots and flight test pioneers. Let's show them our appreciation.
Just going to college, I had soloed in light planes, and then I got in Navy pilot training, and which involves a lot of spare time and looking at clouds, and I got addicted to the thought of flying sailplanes, which I was able to use as an addiction after the war was over in 1945, and it was, I had 2 more years of college and then graduate school, and throughout that period just found sailplane flying was a wonderful hobby, but because I got involved with some real scientists in it, it became a scientific endeavor as one learned about the weather, meteorology, and sailplanes. And simultaneously, I was in weather modification studies, which involved a lot of flying. So all this was kind of mixed up together and very exciting for a youngster.
And when did the goals come about? When did you start thinking, okay, I'm going to apply myself to this, and what were the goals? Where did you want to go with it?
Well, I got out of the active airplane flying by about 1970. The field of weather modification didn't make much sense because if you got commercial projects, you'd invite a bunch of lawsuits by the people who didn't want the weather. And so it was grinding into regular non-aviation type projects at the company. When I began a new company in '71, AeroVironment, we just did miscellaneous things until it dawned on me in 1976 that there was a prize for human-powered flight, prize that was worth about $100,000. And I found this was attractive because I had loaned about $100,000 to a friend to start a company which didn't succeed, and he couldn't pay the loan back, and I had gotten it from a bank, and they wanted it back, and I didn't have it. And here was this prize of $100,000 for a human-powered airplane. So I thought this would be a good thing to work on, and I did. It took quite a bit of thinking and then giving up on it, but I finally realized that there was a different approach than anybody had been using. Very simple approach, but you make it large, but you keep it light, and that was the solution. So in '76 began working on it as a hobby, evenings, weekends, and so on, and luring a few other people into it and paying a few of them a modest amount of money, and the prize then got won in August of '77. But 2/3 of the prize had gone into expenses, and I needed more money. But suddenly Kramer, who had put up the prize for the first flight, came up with a prize for a flight across the English Channel, which he thought would take another 18 years, like his first prize had done. And we realized if you just cleaned up the Gossamer Condor a bit and made what we call the Gossamer Albatross, it could do that much longer flight. The first flight was about a mile distance with some left and right turns, but the across the channel was 21 miles, and we made that work in 1979, and then, while paying people, there was just enough money to retire the debt, and I felt aviation was kind of done, but we decided to start a division at the company in aviation then, and our first project with the DuPont company that supported our previous project was to make a solar-powered airplane, which we felt there'd be no prize for this, but it'd be very important to get people to understand that you really have a lot of energy available from solar cells, which our government had started supporting but then was backing off on. And so we did the solar-powered airplane, and then one thing led to another, and we are now truly an aviation company, but also a car company and a boat company, and we work on things that let you do more with less.
Paul, thank you. Pete Reynolds, first flight, Lear 28. What were the goals for the program? How did it start?
Well, it was a part of the series of the development of the Learjet models, and we had looked at using NASA-developed winglets on our Model 25. And Wichita is kind of a small town, but it's got a lot of aviation interests, and right across the field was Cessna, so there was a lot of interest in what the different companies were doing. And one of the funny things that we did was that when we had modified the airplane, it took us about 6 months to take one of our prototypes and take the tip tanks off. We put on a 6-foot wing extension and the winglets, but we didn't want the other people in town knowing what we were doing, so they built up these fake tip tanks that they would strap on the end of the airplane, and we'd taxi out with those and go out to the run-up pad and have a ground crew come and take them off real quick, and then we'd go and take off, and when we got back in, they had to strap them back on. I'm not sure whether that really worked or not, but it gave the ground crew something else to do.
Wichita, yeah.
Yeah, so it's a small town with a lot of aviation being committed a lot of the time. And the program itself was relatively straightforward. We didn't have too many technical issues. The winglets worked just about as expected in terms of cruise, and they didn't screw up other things like the stall, and actually helped on the directional stability, so we were pretty happy about that. And as these things go, probably the most harrowing moment was not necessarily involved in a well thought out test flight, but it was kind of a publicity stunt after we got the airplane certified. And Neil Armstrong was on the board of directors of the company at the time, and the airplane really was a great high altitude performer. It could climb directly to 50,000 feet, and the J-85s, we use the 610, which is a civilian version of that, and what Doug was talking about, the engines quitting at high altitude, is definitely gives you a start, and we had a lot of experience with that. But we decided to do a time to climb record, and Neil came to Wichita, and we did a couple practice runs in our test area. Each time we kind of refined the climb schedule and lowered our initial fuel. But to get the biggest impact from the publicity, they wanted to do the actual flight from Kitty Hawk Airfield, which ties in well with what we're talking about here. But any of you who have been there, it's a field and a ramp, and this was in the late 70s, so there weren't even any cell phones, but there was a payphone booth at the ramp, and we had to get a direct clearance to 50,000 feet from Washington Center through the Eastern airline traffic from a payphone booth, and then they radioed to us and told us it was okay to go. But we made the climb. It was about 12 and a half minutes, and it was going real well. We turned around and started heading back, and since there was nothing at Kitty Hawk, we had to go about 30 miles further back to Elizabeth City to get fuel. And when we'd done the test flights in Wichita, we were taking off to the west and landing back to the east. And each time we had to use the spoilers to get down because it didn't take us as long to climb as it did to descend. So we turned around and started heading back, and Neil put the spoilers out. And I said, well, let's wait and see how this works. And we had accounted for the extra 30 miles, but what I didn't account for was that when we were doing it in Wichita, we had a tailwind the whole way. And this time we had a headwind the whole way. And so we got down to low altitude, and we're droning on, and there was a quirk in the fuel system of the airplane early on, and when the wing tanks got down to 200 pounds or less, they indicated 0. So we're tooling along about 3,000 feet and about 10 miles out, and Neil reaches down to the fuel selector to check the wing tanks, and I said, no, you don't want to do that. It'll just be discouraging, because we were below 400 pounds, and if you turned the switch, it said we didn't have anything. But we were able to make it in, and the ground crew the next morning fired up the airplane to taxi across the other side of the field and fuel it up. And on the way over, one of the engines quit. So that was probably the most harrowing part of the program. And it's one of those things that you don't think about ahead of time. It's a good lesson learned afterwards.
After this experience and the other prototypes where you flew first flight and all the years you've had at Lear, what's been the most fulfilling part of this for you?
Well, I guess I've started like many of the others as a kid, looking at World War II fighters and just wanting to be involved in that, and I had an interest in the technical side. And just being able to participate in the development of the great machines that we all love and see the industry flourish and the safety improvements that we've been able to do. When you think about what's really happening when somebody's sitting in an airliner or a business jet and it's minus 60 outside and they would suffocate in about 30 seconds if they were exposed to that. People do that in their shirt sleeves, hundreds of thousands of people every day, safer than you can drive to the airport. It's truly an honor to participate in an industry that has provided all that.
John Cashman, how many years did you spend on the 767, the 67X, and the 777?
I started, I was only a brief time as a 6-7 project pilot, and that was a product development program to look at a longer range airplane to fit in another place in the market with a higher capacity than the 6-7. Originally, we thought it would be a fairly simple derivative, and we looked at longer airplanes, double-deckers, and all based around the 767. Our customers pretty much indicated they wanted a new airplane, a new flight deck, new economies. And so that airplane, which started as the 767X, became the 777. We actually launched the program in 1990. We did the first flight in 1994. Fairly intense 4 years. But in 11 months, we actually certified the airplane. And in a year and a half, we actually had certified 3 different engines and had flown about 7,500 hours in the flight test program. So it was rather intense.
What was so new about it? What were all the changes that were being asked for in a new airplane?
Well, actually, from a Boeing standpoint, a lot of what was new was the process of the development. From a customer standpoint, we actually we were adding features that not only the pilots were looking for, but the economics of the airline was looking for. Maintenance, replaceability of parts, particularly in a maintenance standpoint, very good fuel economics, reliable engines. I mean, the usual things that most of us go for, but emphasized to really keep the cost down in the daily operation. But from the Boeing standpoint, we were looking at new ways of making airplanes, of integrating all of the teams that work, not just the engineering team and the flight test team, but the manufacturing team, the tooling, the marketing, the sales, communications. We came up with a way of trying to do the certification for over-water operation at first delivery rather than after building a lot of hours in service to prove that point, which we did achieve. So that when the customer got the airplane, it was a service-ready airplane, not only in terms of its reliability at dispatch, but their ability to use it immediately in over-water operation.
I keep hearing the term lessons learned, and especially in all the papers that have been delivered and are delivered continually. What are the lessons learned for Boeing in this whole process of starting this process to create essentially a new airplane? What are the lessons learned for Boeing or for anybody else who wants to create a new airplane?
Well, that's a really good question. There's a lot of good lessons. There's a few, obviously, lessons learned are both plus and minus. The lesson learned was that the working together concept worked fantastically well, getting everybody to feel they were a major part of the program, no matter what their job was. The ability to speak up when things weren't going right. The fact was, though, we did a lot of testing. We did try to design it right the first time, for sure, but that means you still go test the heck out of it before first flight and after first flight. And so we found a lot of things. We built, we had several test beds for the engine, test beds for the fly-by-wire concept. We use a 757. We had a fully integrated ground test facility that used real parts, real engine generators. The actual flight test instrumentation system was checked out on the ground. But one of the things of doing all that is it costs a lot of money. And I don't think that's any surprise, but doing it all over again, we would certainly, knowing what really added value and what didn't, we would cut back on some of those expenditures. I mean, we have to be competitive, really. I think we did the right thing at the time for what we knew, but to do it again, the lesson would be you have to choose very carefully where those dollars go. And it's not universal to Boeing or even the aeronautical industry.
Burt, as I listened to you this morning in your paper and look at what you have done in your aviation career and with scale, I sense that you are a student of the history of all of this. And here we are on this centennial of flight, and I'm sure you have looked back to the Wright brothers and everything that has happened since as you go to work every day. What goes through your mind when you go back to what the Wrights did in your head and the people that followed and the Doolittles and the Lindberghs and the going supersonic with the Jaegers and the teams and on up through space when you think about what you're doing right now? How do you think about all this?
History. At least Arnold and Bustamante were given the questions in advance here. I'm not sure what I have actually, I have been reading a lot about the early history of airplanes because I saw parallels to what I think needed to be done in access to space for people. I saw parallels to this wonderful time period, not 1903, but I think a much more significant time period that occurred in early 1908. Before that, there had been only 10 people to ever fly. And then a milestone occurred. And then within 3 years, there were airplanes by the hundreds in 39 countries, thousands of pilots, the airplane being invented by natural selection. The ones that crashed or didn't fly somehow weren't done again. But the milestone that occurred in 1908 was just kind of a worldwide realization that, damn, I can do that. These guys are bicycle shop guys. I can do that. Glenn Curtis was a very early motorcycle guy. And they realized, others, many others realized that this is something within my grasp. And that was the milestone that made this wonderful renaissance of the development of the airplane into a practical tool. And later on they found out, we can run the mail, we can have warplanes, we can maybe have airliners and all of this stuff. But it was all done mainly with a spark that I can do it. Now the difference in space travel is there is not that realization anywhere. You talk to anybody and there's not a realization that I can do that. Mm-hmm. It's only something that, I hope someday within my lifetime, NASA will do something so that I can do it. See, there's a totally different thing between those two. So I think what happened in the time period 1908, 9, and 8, 9, 10, 11, that was the phenomenal time period. And I just would have loved to be around when all that was happening. Worldwide, 39 countries, the airplane being invented and flown and raced and competed in air shows and so on.
So how does that
Phenomenal.
Apply to what you have committed yourself to over the last, 20, 25 years?
I don't know how this is going to work out. First of all, what we've been doing just the last, 5, 6 years here, if that works out successfully, I think there's a possibility that others will say, well, I can do that too. And then I think there's some wonderful things that can happen. We don't really know what will happen, just any more than people knew in 1908 what good the airplane was for.
Yeah.
I see some things, and this is a general aviation and commercial. I think you're going to ask me questions about that, but
Okay.
First of all, airlines. Let me give you my opinion of airlines. I think that Boeing and the airlines do things for Boeing and for the airlines rather than for the passengers. First of all, they build these enormous, great big round fuselages, and then they put everybody's elbows, which is the widest part, at the same waterline, the same fuselage station. And it was a lot more convenient to travel in many ways back in the 60s, where if you missed your flight, you go to the next counter for the same money. They'd say, well, get on this one. And we never heard of a hub. A hub is for the airlines, not for the passengers. I really think that, first of all, there's not going to be this big continuous growth. We've had airliners for 65 years. They're not going to have growth for another 65. They're really, just like the Greyhound bus didn't really grow and frolic. Well, some people, the Greyhound bus still comes to Mojave, actually, but I was a real proponent that the little airplane with thousands of airports rather than the big airliners with dozens of airports was really the answer. And you could apply a lot of little technologies to that. Synthetic vision, so you can see through the clouds, is the most obvious one. In cockpit, your own decisions, collision avoidance, and then the airplane skips out of the way even if you try to run into them. There's a lot of things that could be done. And at one time, not that long ago, I put together and said, if you do all of these technologies, that then flying your little airplane in the weather will be user-friendly enough so that this new transportation system will blossom. One of the things that was on the list was a better de-icing, and we've solved that, of course, because the leading edges get real hot after re-entry. But in general, I think what's going to happen before the airliners get a lot better, and maybe before, unless we do it right now, we have a real expanded small airplane transportation systems, is it will be overrun by how well we're doing in virtual reality, such that you can't tell you're not there, and then why bother going? Again, I wasn't given the questions in advance.
And sometimes that works out really well. When you're talking to Burt Rutan, it does. Do any of you have any questions? I know that they haven't gotten any questions from any of you either, so yes, sir.
Burt, do you have any visions of a car that flies?
Do you have a vision?
Visions of a car that flies. Here's the combination of the two worst things we have on transportation now. First of all, I don't think a car that flies the way Molt Taylor thought was the solution back in the 60s and 70s really isn't a solution now, because it means that we have just all kinds of runways all over the place. Sides of, run into weather, you land next to the road, and you drive for a while and then take off. That was his vision. Other visions by some of these guys say the answer is hovering. If I can hover, then I can not need an airport, see. Well, hovering is absolutely the worst thing you can do for throughput. And hovering will probably never be able to do it without making a lot of noise and using a lot of energy. So I had this wonderful idea that actually for a while, until a couple of years ago, I presented this as the real solution. And that is, you use the energy of an airplane that lands by deceleration, and you store that for a few seconds, and you use it to accelerate the next airplane. Now, in communities, you could have this kind of a thing. First of all, if you slow down at only 2.5 Gs, you know, you can stop in the distance of this room from a light airplane stall speed, so you don't need airports then. So I envision, let's say in every community, you'd have these little launch and recovery buildings, okay, where the airplane would come in. First of all, you don't make a lot of energy grinding along with gear down and flaps, and you don't make full power coming off. See, these airplanes would come in and out quietly. And then take that to the big city where you need a lot of people to go, not out where all the airports are. Now they stack up like this. And I showed that if you don't hover, in other words, you never fly slow, that you could have tremendous throughput, and it would all be done with this big stack of as tall a skyscraper as you want. Now the picture, though, painted an airliner flying into a skyscraper. So, you know, or a general aviation airplane flying into a skyscraper. So after 9/11, I knocked that off, so I haven't talked much about that anymore.
This is why I suggested how many of you and how many in the aviation community say that this man is perhaps the most creative thinker in aviation today. Thank you, ladies and gentlemen. Gentlemen, thank you very much.